Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Voltimum webinar series. My name's Ed Grock. I'll be your presenter for today's topic on WHS legislation, the big, hairy, ugly legislation that we have today. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box on the left side, and they'll be answered as best we can during the course of the webinar. Of course, with this topic, questions can be fairly long and fairly detailed, and in some cases very particular to a certain circumstance, workplace or environment. So if you feel you have a question like that, please also just leave your email address in there, and we'll come back to it if it's a little too detailed to get to during the actual webinar itself. All right, and with that, on we go. So what we intend to try and cover today is really only selected key components of the new Act, as well as discussing some of the basic regulatory compliance that is required and your obligations in line with the changes in the new Act. Really, there are now a lot more than ever reasons, if you like, that it's necessary for you to actually do something. Previously in the old Act you could hide behind certain clauses and things, but obviously in the new one it's a lot more difficult to do that. Now, we are assuming that everybody online is coming from a place of having a fundamental understanding of what an Act is and what it's about and what it actually means. So basically the Work Health and Safety Act as we know it today, the harmonised legislation, it was formally enacted by the Council of Australian Governments, or COAG, in 2008. It was a finalisation of many years of toing and froing by the various state governments to come up with some sort of legislation that could be applied across the whole country. Now, it was released as a draft in 2011 for further review and comment and so on, and was finally revised and released into law in 2012 as it says there, the Work Health and Safety Act 2011. Now, the stakeholders that were involved in the refinement of the document were many and varied. They include, representatives from the various WorkCover and WorkSafe associations around the country, unions, various industry associations and groups and so on. And what they've come up with is a model that can be uniformly applied across the country. Now, with the changes to the legislation, there are a few that are very significant, there are a few that are just changes in terms, and there are a few that make a lot of difference to the levels of liability that can be held by various office holders. As well as that, there's a lot more definition around who is an office holder and what it actually means to exercise due diligence, who are the duty holders and so on. And they include the use of several new terms in definitions as well. I've highlighted a few of them there in red that we'll go into in a little bit more detail. Now when you hear the term worker, it has a formal definition. It includes employees. It can include now volunteers, contractors, subcontractors, apprentices, work experience students, labour hire personnel, and so on. So the term worker now in the Act does have a formal definition. And again, everything we're going through now is kind of a preamble to what we're getting to towards the end and how you need to actually cover yourself for a lot of these things. An officer, by definition under the new Act, is someone who's designated as a senior executive, someone who makes or participates in making decisions that affect a substantial part of the business or undertaking. Now, there's also a new term in the new Act that's referred to as PCBU, or persons conducting business or undertaking. Now, an officer must also exercise the due diligence required, of course, to make sure that all the PCBUs comply with the WHS legislation. Now, it's important to understand, if you are an officer by definition, and we will go into that in a little bit, you cannot delegate these duties. You cannot delegate the responsibility to ensure that the PCBUs comply with the various changes in the various sections of the legislation. Now, if you have a look at a couple of those points here again, we'll just quickly drill into a couple of them. Where we say the term worker includes employees, volunteers, contractors, etc., as it does here, It's basically saying that the definition of a worker is someone who is in the workplace, be they there for whatever reason. Previously, if someone was a volunteer, and in some cases you can even be liable for visitors to the workplace. So it's very important to understand the term worker now has a very broad definition. Now, the new way of expressing officers' responsibilities. Currently, some occupational health and safety acts around the country, or previous acts if you like, attributed liability to officers where a corporation was in breach of a duty. Basically what it meant was there was kind of a reverse onus of proof to show that they did what was reasonably practicable, or they had no influence in relation to the breach. So in other words, if you were an officer, you might be a director or a business owner or something sitting in an office, never having been to a particular site. You could basically delegate that responsibility and almost offhand it. Whereas now, under the definition of officers, you're actually far more responsible for making sure that the PCBUs and so on are doing their job correctly. Now this term PCBU is one we get asked about a lot. Who is actually a PCBU and what does it actually mean? The term PCBU, literally persons conducting business or undertaking. Now by definition and inside the Act, a person inside that sentence may be delegated as an organisation or an individual. Now until recently, many of the main duty holders under the health and safety laws were basically employers. And that is the entity which the law recognises the person in an employment relationship with an employee. Now it's a case where an individual can also become a person conducting business or undertaking. So what that basically means is an individual, as it says there, can be a person, but will only be a PCBU where the individual is conducting in their own right. So I think for many of you being SMEs, you might find that as a sole trader or a self-employed person, the WHS Act now does very, very clearly indicate that an individual is not a PCBU if they're involved in a business or undertaking as a worker or an officer of the business. So if you're a director or if you're an owner or if you're someone that can significantly make financial decisions in the business, you may be considered not to be a PCBU. But if you have any direct control over the health or safety of any of the employees or people inside an organisation, you will be designated as a PCBU now. And again, that does include sole traders, principal contractors. It can even include things like unincorporated associations, partnerships, franchises, all sorts of things. Now, if you are engaged solely as a worker or an officer of a business or undertaking, you are excluded by the legislation or in the legislation from the definition of a PCBU. Same as if you are involved in a volunteer association, so if you're unpaid inside an association. If there's a group of volunteers working together, for example, for community purposes, so on, none of those volunteers employ any people to carry out work for that association, so they wouldn't be designated either as PCBU. Now, we did mention as well there that a PCBU can actually be designated as an organisation or an individual as well. Now, where an organisation is designated as a PCBU, it's basically the business entity conducting the activities of the business or undertaking rather than the individual employed by that entity. So senior managers and directors and so on would generally be considered officers under the WHS laws rather than PCBUs. Again, the reason we're sort of going on about this a little bit is because the definitions and responsibilities will change considerably as we go on a little bit. It's important to understand who is and who isn't actually responsible. Now, when we talk about who is and who isn't an officer, it's a fairly simple exercise. Basically, an officer of a business is generally a senior executive, someone who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business or undertaking. They also would generally have a positive duty to be proactive to continuously ensure that the business or undertaking complies with all the relevant duties and obligations under the Act. And it doesn't really matter what the Act is or what version of the Act. That part of it really hasn't changed too much. So basically, again, as we've outlined there, a director or secretary of a corporation, or again, someone who makes or participates in making decisions that do affect the whole or part of a company. Generally speaking, again, the penalties that can be designated to officers, as they have an overarching responsibility to ensure all compliance, will vary. So really the changes to the new Act put more responsibility on those directly responsible for the health and safety of others. It's important also to understand that under the formal definition under corporate law, anyone even if they are, for example, a receiver manager, an administrator of a corporation or a company, administrator of a deed of company, a liquidator of a corporation, they can all, by the way the Act is now currently written, be considered to be officers as well. So if you do ever find yourself in that situation, or working with or having acquired another organisation, you can very quickly be held responsible under the definition of an officer inside the new Act. Now we want to have a look at the definition as well of duty of care, and this one is critically important. A person conducting a business or undertaking, again, must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, and we will get to the formal definition of reasonably practicable in a minute, because if you're anything like me, you feel it's a fairly washy term and very hard to defend. But so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of all of the listed entities you can see there, any workers engaged or caused to be engaged by the person. Again, any workers whose activities in carrying out work are influenced or directed by the person while the person is at work in the business or undertaking. So what that's really saying, that as far as is reasonably practicable, you must make sure that you've done everything you possibly can to keep the people that are in your employ safe. And that is everybody on the work site, the job site, the office, whatever it might be. And they can include things like, provision of adequate facilities for people's welfare while they're at work in carrying out their work. These responsibilities do also extend to things like bullying and harassment. They extend to things like discrimination. They extend right across a massive subsection of the Act, not just those particularly dangerous activities. Now, it also states that in the definition of reasonably practical, you must provide any information or training or instruction or supervision that's necessary to protect all persons from any risk to their health or safety arising from any work they might be doing. Now, I understand in your industry, as with many industries, we've been involved in mining and construction and so on for many, many years. You rely heavily on externally ratified qualifications and so on. But again, it's important, and we will go into it in a moment, to make sure that any qualifications that come through your door attached to somebody, it's your responsibility to make sure they're correct and ratified. So again, it's also important under the definition of reasonably practical that the health and safety of workers and the conditions of the workplace are monitored for the purpose of preventing illness and injury. Now these definitions are directly from the Act. So what it's saying is the basics as well, providing the right first aid facilities and right facilities for workers as defined in the Act. It's all very, very important now, and all comes under prosecutable offences. It's a fairly simple definition, and I've experienced this one firsthand with the defence of a couple of cases in work cover hearings and so on. If you think what could be done or what can be done should be done, don't shirk your responsibility. If you feel that something requires some sort of risk assessment, some sort of hazard assessment, some sort of particular PPE, some sort of training, some sort of checking whether something else might be required to render it safe or safer, make sure you do it. Reasonably practical literally means what can be done should be done. There is a rider in the change to the Act, and it does say unless it's reasonable in the circumstances for the duty holder to do something less. And it's that word reasonable that will come into question should you ever be caused or should you ever find yourself with cause to defend it. So it's a very objective term, and it will usually not be a fun time to test its objectivity when you're in a courtroom or a hearing, I can assure you. It basically means that the duty holder must meet the standard of behaviour expected of a reasonable person in the duty holder's position. So if you're the person that can directly affect the health and safety of someone and you fail to do that, in whatever way, shape or form, if it's lack of supply of a particular piece of PPE or training or whatever it might be, the presiding person will decide whether it was reasonably practicable or not for you to actually make that decision, and will proceed accordingly. Now, there are two primary elements as well to what is reasonably practicable. I mean, a duty holder must first consider what can be done. As we said, what can be done. If it's possible to do something, but it would make a substantial financial difference to the organisation for a very, very minor improvement, then it would be thought that that would perhaps not be reasonable. So if it is possible in the circumstances for ensuring the health and safety by doing something that's not going to completely destroy an on time or an on budget or something like that, then you must consider whether it's reasonable, and in the circumstances you must do it if it's possible. A perfect tangible example of this is a prosecution that's happened not that long ago, where a full roof system for a tilt-up factory complex that they had a habit of actually building on the ground, they decided to build it in situ. Young fella had actually fallen off the roof, came time for a hearing, and they were actually prosecuted because they had a history of actually building them on the ground and craning them complete into place, and failed to do that at this particular site for whatever reason. So again, if you make a decision that for minor financial reasons will endanger the safety of people, it will be considered as you didn't take all the reasonably practicable steps. And there are many, many things we can add to that, and tangible examples we could give you. If you want to have a look and determine what is reasonably practicable, and the process is fairly simple. If you take into account all of the relevant factors, is it going to slow the work down too much? Is it going to be hideously expensive? Is it going to blow a budget? Am I putting people at what level of risk? Have I correctly applied my risk hazard assessments? Have I correctly applied the hierarchy to ensure that we control it as best we possibly can? As long as you've applied the highest possible level of reasonable protection to a particular hazard or circumstance, you will be considered to have applied what is reasonably practicable, or done everything that is reasonably practicable. Now, there is no single matter, should you ever come time for a hearing, and I hope for everyone's sake that never happens, that you are forced to defend a particular incident that may or may not have occurred. I hope you have done everything you possibly could. Again, if you just remember, under reasonably practicable, if it's possible, do it. Now, one of the other primary changes to the new Act is the onus of proof. Under the old OHS Act, there was basically a duty written into the Act that said you have to ensure a healthy and safe workplace for everyone that basically enters, all workers or all employees was the determination. It also gave you subject a limited defence. So what that meant was you were almost considered guilty of having a breach if someone got hurt on your site. It was a reverse onus of duty. Now, under the new Act, the onus moves to the prosecution to establish that the employer or PCBU or office holder, whomever, did not take all reasonably practical measures to prevent any risk. Now, what that basically means is you will have now, should you have any sort of issue, particularly in a work cover type situation, I can tell you in New South Wales, I've actually seen this, where they will actually be out to, prove you didn't do everything you reasonably could. Did you take all reasonably practical measures? They will be required to set out what the employer could have reasonably done to prevent the risk to health and safety. So what that means is that inside the Harmonised Act, or the new Act, the prosecution must prove that the employer has not, so far as is reasonably practicable, ensured the health and safety of its employees. And they have all sorts of ways and loopholes and means of doing that. And we've seen many times with what we do, one of the primary mistakes, if you like, or one of the primary limiting factors in a lot of this is that a lot of employers or a lot of PCBUs fail to actually log, fail to actually keep a suitable audit trail, and fail to actually be able to properly identify the things that they've done. In many cases, it's not that they haven't done it, it's just that they have not recorded it or used a proper system to actually allow them to produce evidence should they're required to do so. Now again, the onus does change considerably for directors and officers. Under the old Act, it was basically prima facie liable for any contravention of the Act for a director or a person concerned, which, again, on consideration, if you're a director of a major corporation sitting in your George Street office and you've never been to the site that might be in Wollongong, it's hardly a good situation to be held responsible for any breach of a WHS Act on a site you may have never been to. Under the new Act, Section 26 has been amended. It imposes a duty on officers of a corporation, which again we've drilled into a little bit who they are, to exercise due diligence to ensure that all PCBUs and responsible people comply with the OHS or WHS and safety duties. So now what it's saying, and this is why we mentioned before, those responsibilities of an officer cannot be delegated. They are still the responsibility of the officer, but the responsibility and the liability is actually tiered through PCBUs and so on now. Now, we've listed out there a few of the points that are actually mentioned in the actual legislation itself, and they're all fairly basic stuff. It is the responsibility of an officer to make sure they keep up to date knowledge of WHS or OHS matters. Are they reading the reports? Are they checking what's going on? Are they making sure that those PCBUs on sites and so on are actually complying? Because ultimately they will be sitting on the wrong side of the table with the PCBU in any sort of adverse action. It's very important as well, if you are an officer of a company, to understand the nature of its operation. Understand what it actually is that people are doing on a lot of these sites. Again, we've experienced it quite a bit in mining and so on, where a lot of the officers under the old Act basically sat back and said, well, look, I'm going to be liable anyway, so let's just cross that bridge when we get there. Now the way the Act is written, it's up to them to make sure they have a fundamental understanding, not be specialists on everything, but a fundamental understanding of, the inherent and most present dangers that are on all of their, or involved in all of the applications around their business. Now, another very important one as well, there are certain sections in the new Act that do say that you have to have consultation and various other bits and pieces that we won't go too far into today. But it is up to the officers of the company and the directors of the company to ensure all reasonable steps to put those committees, those HSRs and those people that are required to be responsible for those things into the right places in a timely manner. And this will be measured should there be any sort of issue. And it's one of the first questions that will be asked. I can guarantee you in a work cover hearing, we recently had a client who was absolutely belted by work cover over exactly that. And again, make sure appropriate processes for complying with all of the various parts of the reporting, consultation, training, all of those things again falls directly back to the officers via the PCBUs. Now it's important to understand too, if you do fall under that definition of an officer, under the old legislation, um, basically, you could have orders imposed on you or the company to take steps to remedy any matters that the offence may have caused, be it compensation, whatever it might be, work cover, investigation costs. You may have been forced to publicise the offence or so on. Now, under the new Act, sentencing can include enforceable undertakings, remedial orders, adverse publicity orders, training orders, injunctions, compensation orders, community service orders, in addition to any other administered penalty. So it's really, really important to make sure that if you are an officer, that everyone in your employ is doing the right thing and they all have the right tools and training they need to actually do that. Now I know what we've banged on with so far is a little bit long-winded in some cases, and I do apologise for that, but it's important to have a fundamental understanding of some of those definitions before we get too far into this part of what we want to talk about, and that is what now? We see and hear it from our clients all the time, and it's usually once there's been some sort of adverse situation that we're trying to cobble together in conjunction with them some level of evidence. During a industrial relations hearing, an industrial relations commissioner was heard to say exactly those words you see there. If you do nothing, you will never prove you did anything. This has been tested a couple of times. We've been forced to test it with some of our clients, and I can tell you the results have not been very favourable. However, in many cases, the something you did, however small it may be, may make a massive difference to any finding that's dished out. So the first step you need to really think about, and this is one where a lot of employers let themselves down massively, and that is inductions. Now, I'm not sure what an induction looks like in your organisations, but primarily it's one of the first things we would do if we were to go and audit a particular organisation, is have a look at that induction process. Because under all WHS legislation in Australia, there is still a few that are dragging the chain, WA, etc. Employers do have a duty to provide adequate information, instruction and training, as well as supervision and so on, to all employees, be they new and existing. Now, we've been to certain clients when we've performed WHS audits or had a look at their systems, or even where, for example, part of our organisation is a labour hire organisation, and one of the things we do is have a look at our host employers' induction systems. And more often it involves someone being handed a book and, sat down with a 5-minute conversation and shown where the bathrooms are, and that's about where it finishes. They sign a book, hand it back, never read it, and off they go. And I can tell you firsthand that this is absolutely unacceptable under the new WHS legislation. Not only do you have a duty to provide adequate information, but you also have a duty to ratify the skill sets that are actually claimed by some of your employees. That's when you have to ask yourself, is your induction system adequate? Now, there is a far greater onus placed back on PCBUs and officers to ensure that they've identified and controlled all hazards and risks associated with a worker's role. The reason I read that verbatim is that is exactly what's written into the legislation. Now, what that means is if someone comes to you and, as I say, claims to have a ticket or a license or whatever it might be all terrific and tickety-boo and valid and all of those sorts of things, but there is a responsibility for you to actually do some sort of validation of that particular qualification. A perfect example of it, again in a recent hearing, a colleague of mine was bailed up by a particular magistrate when asked during a work cover claim, or a workers' compensation claim rather, regarding a motor accident. Person was injured driving a company vehicle at work. The question was asked, how will you aware, or what evidence did you have that this person was adequately able to handle and control that vehicle? To which the response was probably the same one I would have given, in that he had a valid driver's license and it was current and it was, not cancelled, and he'd been driving for 20 years. To which the magistrate responded, how did you instruct him to drive your vehicle? Then it becomes a whole other story. After the fact, he sat down with the particular magistrate and asked, well, what would you have expected? That was when he was told, do something, do anything, have some sort of written test, have some sort of evidence to say that you have actually given someone an induction on that vehicle and shown them or given them some instruction as to how to adequately use that vehicle, even if you're stating that it's in compliance with the road rules, whatever it might be. And again, I know this is a fairly basic and silly example, but think about it in the terms of some of the high-risk qualifications that do come across, with rigging and dogging and some of the, I guess, high-tension electrical and so on, some of you guys probably get involved in. It's very important to ratify those skill sets, just to give yourself some sort of documentation that says, here's what we've done, and we've made sure it's adequate for the role the person is actually going through. And again, just because someone says they can doesn't always mean they can. We see this massively with our labour hire section. We have all sorts of various qualifications come from various parts of the world. There are some we can put a little bit of stock in, and there are others we just dismiss straight away for obvious reasons. It's very important, if it's possible, to check a trade license, to double check someone's first aid certification is valid and in date. Make sure people have updated high-risk cards if necessary. You'll find many sites and many construction areas and so on today will do their own verification of competencies for any high-risk work, be it plumbing, electrical, building, and all of these sorts of things. And these are done basically to, again, allow them to be in compliance with the Act. They're not allowing any contractor or anyone on site without first verifying that just because they say they're a plumber or an electrician, making sure they do have the skill sets required to actually do it, and giving themselves some sort of validation of that and an evidence trail. Again, on evidence, it's particularly important to have an adequate evidence trail should you ever be subject to an audit. This is one place where most of these things do tend to fall down. How would you prove, if you sat back in your chair right now and said, if I was audited because someone got hurt, how would I prove I adequately inducted the person into Hello everybody, I hope the sound's come back. If someone could let me know in the chat box. Terrific, thank you. Okay, so we talk about, do you have a system? And a system of WHS recording and compliance really does start with your induction. Do you have a system that you measure yourselves against? I'm not sure the structure of many of your businesses, but a lot of SMEs, generally I know when we provide particular external labour to them, you'll ask them about a WHS system. They'll pull an old folder out of a cupboard with a few things that were signed, usually back in about 2003 somewhere, blow the dust off it and plonk it on a table. I can assure you that the nice man from work cover won't look too favourably on that. So, do you have a system? I was recently asked to complete an AS 4801 compliance, which is an Australian and New Zealand WHS standard compliance for a new entity, and drilled right down into the nature of the business. This particular business is contracting with a major national infrastructure project, and is severely sort of measured and constantly measured against very high WHS standards. And for those of you that haven't looked at implementing something like a 4801 system or something similar, it really is worth looking at, because you end up with a completely ratified set of documents that will allow you to very, very simply maintain an ongoing register of compliance and have a very, very good audit trail should it ever be required. It's important to understand too that a system is more than just a few safe work method statements or risk assessments or having a few material safety data sheets around your building. A system can include anything from regulatory signage to correct fire extinguishers, to correct first aid, and all of these sorts of things. So there's a heck of a lot more to it than just a few forms. Now, one of the other areas we see that a lot of our clients fall down is, if you do have a system, do you use it? And how do you use it? And how often do you use it? You do have to be very, very wary of a couple of things with having a WHS system. And it's really the difference between ignorance and negligence by legal definition. If you have it and don't use it, then you become negligent. If you don't have it, well, then you're just ignorant. So you have to be very, very careful that if you do have a system, keep it live. Make sure you complete it. This system will only grow and only become as strong as the information you put into it. Ensure that if you have a system that says you'll audit the system every 6 months, then do ensure that it's done. If you have a system that says your safety committee is going to meet every 6 weeks, ensure they do meet. Make sure it's minuted. Make sure they're meeting in accordance with the legal requirements. Because again, and finally, if your system would stand legal scrutiny, if you had to open that system to a magistrate or open your current WHS compliance documentation that you have in place to a magistrate or a legal inquiry, how do you think it would stand up? Would you be confident in saying, again, I did everything that was reasonably practicable for me to do to ensure that everybody in my employ was safe, or everybody in my responsibility was safe? If you're a director or an officer, it's up to you to make sure that those people that are working for you in the roles as PCBUs are maintaining those responsibilities as well. It's not necessarily up to you to physically do it, but again, ask yourself, absolutely, would your system stand any sort of legal scrutiny? And again, remember what we said before, if you do nothing, you will never prove you did anything. You need to ask yourself again, could you prove you did everything you could to ensure your workers' safety? Could you prove you properly inducted someone? We find more often that at very quick audit, well, when we start to talk to clients about this topic, as I said before, the first thing we start with is induction. We find ourselves generally with a lot of clients, and some fairly major ones too, I might say, going right back to the induction stage and re-inducting staff and just making sure and documenting the fact that we have gone through and covered all of the things that are the new things that are coming up into WHS spotlight, things like workplace bullying and harassment, things like equal opportunity employment, things like making sure people do have a fundamental understanding of the changes to the legislation that directly affect them. One of the other things to ask yourself, if you could prove you did everything you could, And it's an open question. Has anybody actually informed their staff of the changes to the legislative or the legislation and what their responsibilities now are inside the changes to the legislation? It's important now to know that by definition, anyone who's deemed to be a worker on site now has a legal responsibility to ensure their actions or omissions, and omissions is a very important one, don't adversely affect the health and safety of anyone else on site. And this is something that keeps coming up as well, in that if there is any sort of issue that results in any sort of adverse action or prosecution, it's important to make sure that you've informed all of your staff that they can also be held legally responsible, as will PCBU's officers and so on. So again, make sure you can prove you did everything you can to ensure your workers' safety, everything that was reasonably practicable. Now we will have as well in the near future, in conjunction with Voltimum, various online options to help with this sort of thing for you. But as I say, it's very, very difficult here to drill too far into specifics, and trying to keep these things very general does sometimes make them a little bit confusing. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to contact us at any point after the webinar as well. We are contactable via Voltimum. And we would be happy to help you answer any of those questions or queries as well. So with that, I think we've banged on probably for long enough. I'd like to thank everyone's viewers that did tune in today to this Voltimum webinar. We will have a short survey at the end if you'd like to participate. So thank you to everybody. And again, should anyone wish to contact us, please, we are contactable through Voltimum at any time after the webinar. Thank you for your time, and don't forget about the survey if you wish to participate.